As you view the reading of this passage, you'll notice some highlighted selections of text. What I want you to do is garner meaning from these specific snippets in order to answer the reasoning beyond the text question that follows the passage. This question will require you to demonstrate that you know how to extrapolate ideas mentioned in the passage and apply them to new situations presented in the answer choices. All right? So in order to do this, you're going to have to understand the assumptions underlying the article and how the new information presented in the answer choices will shift the central thesis of the passage. So good luck and happy reading. Paragraph 1. The studies of adaptation tend to privilege literature over film, but not the other way around, and assume that a film adaptation has certain responsibility to remain faithful to the spirit of the text upon which it is based. The main purpose of Hsu Huang Detman's book, adapted for the screen, The Cultural Politics of Modern Chinese Fiction and Film, I would argue, is to provide some alternative thoughts besides. This assumption of how film and fiction should be viewed in adaptation studies. Detman is interested in how filmmakers have gone about the business and art of transposition from one medium to another. This transposition and the processes involved in it, in turn, enrich our understanding of the interconnectedness of the cultural context of texts and artists in Chinese films and fictions. In other words, Detman does not simply deal with the issue of what can be transferred in moving from fiction to film, namely narrative, and what cannot be. More importantly, she investigates the distinct ideological goals of writer and filmmaker that contribute to the differences between text and films. Paragraph 2. Detman looks at the connections between film and fiction in the context of various Chinese communities on the one hand and contemplates their differences on the other hand. For example, one case study that Detman uses to illustrate gender politics is the adaptation of Su Tong's novel Wives and Concubines into Zhang Yimou's film Raise the Red Lantern. Detman argues that Zhang draws from the strengths of Sue's plots and reconfigures the story's narrative codes, notably transforming a key symbolic site in the novel. A defunct meaning no longer functioning, definitions are not a part of the original text. Well in a back garden, into a rooftop death chamber. As a result, Song's new metaphor illustrates the important directional option of changing the staging of the story to maximize the cinematic effect. The well in the novella, a novella is a short novel or a long story, and the compound roof in the film not only map out key theoretical differences between the two texts, but the distinct approaches to the exploitation of women also reflect profoundly different conceptions of the relationship between art and society. These two metaphorical spaces, Detman suggests, not only juxtapose meaning place or deal close together for contrasting effect, the fluidity of feminine ambivalence, ambivalence meaning the state of having mixed feelings or contradictory ideas about something or someone, with the solidity of the patriarch's iron rule, but also open up very distinct imaginary space for the reader and the viewer. Paragraph 3. Many scholars argue that the one thing that literature and film have in common is narrative. By narrative, I mean a series of events, sequentially connected by virtue of their involving a continuing set of characters. Detman questions this assumption in her book. One example is the adaptation of Liu Yichang's novel Intersection into Wong Kar-wai's film In the Mood for Love. In Detman's analysis, Wong appears to radically distill Liu's novel into something other than 3 frames containing 3 separate quotations: the opening shot, an intertitle, and a concluding still. Instead of reconstructing the literary narrative, Wong creates a new storyline, thereby challenging the assumption shared by many adaptation scholars that narrative is the property that makes 2 media commensurable. Commensurable meaning measurable by the same standard. Liberating filmic adaptation from almost every question of fidelity. Wong's style pushes us to recognize that Detman calls what Detman calls abstract adaptation, a style that creates a new theoretical dialogue about how film and literature can intersect to reproduce aesthetic resonances. Resonances here meaning a quality that makes something personally meaningful or important to someone. Detman refuses to privilege one reading or form over another and remains focused on the distinct ways in which they have been received. All right. Which of the following is least likely to be considered a film adaptation by Detman? A French film that uses the exact same dialogue and plot as Les Miserables. B An Indian film that completely changes and rewrites the entire storyline of Shakespeare's Hamlet. C A silent film adapting a dialogue-heavy novella that takes place in a murder trial. Or D A filmmaker and a writer who coincidentally create similar work with no exposure to each other's work. Definitely press pause if you need to and open up a second window to view the reading of the passage and the specific paragraphs you need to support selecting the correct answer choices. I'll give you a moment to think. All right, this is a reasoning beyond a text question, which wants you to extrapolate the ideas discussed in the passage to the new scenarios presented in the answer choices, all right? So obviously the correct answer choice is going to be D, a filmmaker and writer who coincidentally create similar work with no exposure to each other's work, okay? But let's see why. First of all, in paragraph 3, the author mentions a filmmaker who creates an entirely new storyline, thereby challenging the assumption shared by, this is a quote, okay? Challenging the assumption shared by many adaptation scholars that narratives is the property that makes 2 media commensurable, okay? So the fact that an Indian film completely changes the storyline of Hamlet, answer choice B, probably would not disqualify it from being considered an adaptation in Detman's mind. At the same time, Detman never argues that replicating the exact plot and storyline of a book is not considered adaptation. Rather, Detman aims to expand the rigid definition of the view of adaptation, okay? So these two are out. And then finally, again, in paragraph 3, the author still considered a novel turned quote into nothing other than 3 frames containing 3 separate quotations, the opening shot, the intertitle, and a concluding still to be an adaptation. Thus, a silent film interpreting a dialogue-heavy novel would probably still be considered an adaptation in Detman's mind as well. However, 2 artists independently creating similar work is merely a coincidence, and Detman has only focused on discussing filmmakers that are consciously reimagining and adapting original novels into film, right? So that's why the correct answer choice is answer choice D. Okay,